Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Slow from UnderDogGaming. So today we're talking about the Final Fantasy timeline. Now, for a lot of people that have played the Final Fantasy series, you're probably wondering what I mean by Final Fantasy timeline. Well, I know it's not official, and a lot of games don't really seem like they're connected. But if you put the pieces together, a lot of it does feel like they are connected. So I'm just putting a kind of a rough draft out for people to see and possibly work with. We can maybe as a community try and figure this out, maybe possibly even try and find a perfect connection between all these, but this is just more of a rough estimate of possible like what it could possibly be. So first off, we'll just go ahead and start off with the medieval timeline. So it's really hard to know where to start. So the best place I think to start is the first Final Fantasy. So in the first Final Fantasy, they talk about the four warriors of light. The four warriors of light were the first heroes of the story to save the world, and they used what were called the crystals. That was the sign to show that they were the warriors of light. So instead of that, keep that in mind. Now, it does pop up here and there throughout the Final Fantasy series. For example, in Final Fantasy V, which is our next game in the timeline, it talks about the Warriors of Light and the crystals again. So it's pretty easy to say that that one's pretty much the next one in timeline, where seems the same enemy is pretty much coming back in Final Fantasy V. So those are the true kind of connections we have right now with Final Fantasy and Final Fantasy V in the medieval series. So the next one I want to say is Final Fantasy IX, but I don't know a lot about Final Fantasy IX. But as you guys know, I'm doing a Final Fantasy IX blind playthrough, so when we come back to this, maybe I'll have a little bit more information about it, and I can maybe do an update at the end of the month or something. I'm not sure. But the next game into the series I can say is Final Fantasy IV, also known as Final Fantasy II here in America. But Final Fantasy IV is pretty much it. I don't have very much information about it too. It's really hard to say about this, but it's mainly the fact that I didn't play a lot of the earlier Final Fantasies, and hopefully, like I said, if you guys have more information about it, please do enlighten me. But either way, that's it for the medieval age. Let's go on to the next era of the Final Fantasy timeline, which is the industrial timeline. So the start of the industrial era definitely has to be Final Fantasy VI. If you look at it, they use stuff like the magic tech armor, the steampunk. A lot of their stuff is with machinery, and it's pretty safe to start right there is as the start of the industrial age. So the question is, where does it go from there? Well, that's the kind of tricky part, but I believe the next one in the line would be Final Fantasy VIII, due to the fact that it starts to show more of technology growing into being into more of a modern style age, and doing state like from there you can see as it progresses. I believe Final Fantasy VII would come right after that. I want to say Final Fantasy 15, but we don't really have enough information to say that. But doing state, I want to say Final Fantasy 7 comes in because you see the more futuristic styles to it. It has still more of a modern style to it, but it's more futuristic. It's got more of style, more of technology based around its world. But another thing is, I've always pictured, when I've ever seen Final Fantasy 13, I always think of Final Fantasy 7, and so they're I definitely feel like they're very much intertwined. they might be using different terminology, but it's very much intertwined. And it was pretty much at its peak from there. And from there, though, it's pretty safe to say, though, it all fell down in Final Fantasy X. When Sin came through from Final Fantasy X, they were at the top of their technology. I'm sorry, my chair is so damn squeaky. But Final Fantasy X was the beginning of an era for technology. Not Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy 13 was at its peak, and Final Fantasy X was pretty much the end of an era. And due to that, we're going to go into the next one, which is the Ivalice era, which I'm going to pretty much have to say this is pretty much just all speculation at this point. So I'm going to speak about that right now before I cut into the Ivalice era. Pretty much what I believe is during the Final Fantasy X-2, you remember that they started getting more and more into technology, but when the Magus was the Magus weapon, I can't remember. Someone can correct me in the comments below. It was the Magus weapon, I believe is what it was called. And during the state of that, it pretty much probably put more fear into everyone and pretty much wanted everyone to just throw away technology altogether, and which pretty much brings us into the more Ivalice age, which brings us back into being a more medieval style with a lot more technology. And finally, like the Ivalice era is probably like much farther into the future, where people have probably forgotten about the industrial era. But like I said, this is all speculation. If you believe there might be something different, or you don't believe that at all, please let me know. Just don't be an asshole about it. Just let me know. Either way, let's get on to the industrial era. The Ivalice era. This finally brings us to the Ivalice age. So when it comes to the Ivalice age, I believe the right place to start would be Final Fantasy Tactics, due to the state that, again, like I said, they've gone into more of this medieval style with more of a technology feel to it. And it's also, if you looked a lot around the scenery of Final Fantasy Tactics, it has more of a ruined state, kind of like how it was in Final Fantasy X, if you remember correctly. And then from there, and also the thing about there's an airship graveyard near the end of Final Fantasy Tactics, spoiler alert, and that pretty much shows you that kind of is a very big connection there. And then from there, I would have to say it comes into Final Fantasy XII, where there's a slow industrial age rising, as you see through a lot of the technology, and a lot of how a lot of the stuff like Machina and stuff like that is coming back in. Well, they call it magic now, but it's either way, it's still the same premise. Again, like I said before, just because they use different terminology, it's as years go by, you have to think about that. As years go by, then a lot of times change terminologies, and a lot of different other old terminologies are long forgotten, and that's kind of the best way you can think of how to connect these. And Final Fantasy Advanced and Advanced 2 come after that, due to the state that if you look at how Advanced and Advanced 2 start, they have this a modern style look to them, due to the state of that, they're more civil, but they have stuff kind of like the technology of old. And And that pretty much, as far as we know, I'm not going to say that's the end. I feel like more like the Ivalice era is more of where they are currently in the storyline. As more Final Fantasies come through, we'll get more information. But I'm not quite done talking here, because I'm going to talk more about possible games that could be in the timeline too. As I've talked about before, Final Fantasy 15, it hasn't come out. We don't really have a lot of information about it. It's really hard to tell where it would be in the storyline. But once we get like an idea of where it could be in the storyline, then I can safely put it where I think it will be. But I believe it will be in the Industrial Age, because when I watched the King's Glaive movie, there was a lot of similarities to Final Fantasy VII, and that's why I feel like I would put it like after Final Fantasy VIII, but before Final Fantasy VII. And then there's Final Fantasy Type 0, which I feel like would probably be more in the Ivalice era, which is probably a pretty decent speculation. It feel like it's got more of like it's showing the second rising of an industrial age, and puts more in, probably might put more fear into the people. But some people might have forgotten of how that the original industrial age was. We don't hear very many histories about the past and stuff like that. So who knows? Maybe history is doomed to repeat itself. We don't really know. And also, finally, it comes the Japanese Final Fantasy 2s and the Japanese Final Fantasy 3. Again, I know it was eventually ported in through like via DS and stuff like that, and you could play them through that way. But I haven't played them, so it's really hard to speculate where they would be in the story. And finally, I want to talk about World of Final Fantasy. So, World of Final Fantasy, I wouldn't say is the thing that would glue it all together, because that is far from the truth. From anybody that has played World of Final Fantasy, there's no real way to connect them through there, because World of Final Fantasy is kind of like how Kingdom Hearts is, where it's more or less all the characters are put together into one world. So, I'm not saying it couldn't be in the story, and that's why I'm bringing it up. But that's all the time I have for. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. But my name is Slow from UDG. God, I can't talk today. But my name is Slow from UDG. This has been my first video for the Final Fantasy month. I'll catch you guys tomorrow for another video. Peace out.